There are few tales in the annals of the 42nd millennium more impossible than that of the ghost of Sparta. In a galaxy where gods are worshipped through suffering and madness reigns supreme, where the very fabric of reality tears apart under the weight of cosmic malevolence, one mortal had done the unthinkable. Kratos had slain gods before. The pantheon of Olympus had fallen beneath his blades, their ichor staining marble temples across ancient Greece. Yet those had been gods of a single world, bound by the laws of mortality and hubris. The entities that ruled the warp were different. They were concepts given form, emotions crystallized into divinity, fed by the psychic emanations of every sentient being across the galaxy. They were eternal. They were infinite. They were not prepared for the fury of a father who had already lost everything. The first sign that something had changed in the Imperium came when the screaming stopped. Across 1,000 battlefields, the berserkers of Khorne faltered mid-charge, their chainswords falling silent as the rage that had sustained them for millennia simply ended. Blood stopped flowing upward into crimson skies. The brass citadel, that impossible fortress built from the skulls of 1 billion heroes, began to crumble as its foundation, the endless fury of mortal beings, suddenly found itself without a source. Khorne, the blood god, the lord of battle, the first and mightiest of the dark gods, was dead. His death sent shockwaves through the warp that registered on every astropath's consciousness as a moment of perfect, terrible silence. In that instant, every psyker in the Imperium felt the absence where infinite rage had once burned. It was not peace. Peace would have been a blessing. It was simply nothing. And void where something fundamental to the galaxy's spiritual ecosystem had been carved away with surgical precision. The Chaos Space Marines were the first to understand what had happened, though understanding and believing proved to be vastly different concepts. On 1,000 demon worlds, traitor legions watched in horror as their patrons' gifts simply evaporated. Khorne berserkers collapsed mid-slaughter, the butcher's nails in their skulls going silent for the first time since their implantation. World-eaters who had not spoken a coherent word in 10,000 years suddenly found themselves capable of complex thought, and immediately wished they could return to mindless rage rather than confront the magnitude of their crimes. Yet it was not the traitor legions who first witnessed the impossible warrior responsible for this cosmic upheaval. That distinction belonged to a Cadian shock trooper named Tauren Voss, whose regiment had been fighting a desperate holding action against a demonic incursion on the industrial world of Mordian 7. One moment he had been preparing to die as blood letters materialized from the warp to claim his soul. The next, he was watching in stunned silence as something else entirely stepped through the tear in reality. The figure that emerged was tall by human standards, but dwarfed by the greater demons that had preceded him. His skin was ash pale, marked by scars that spoke of battles beyond counting. Crimson tattoos spiraled across his arms and torso in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. Most striking were his weapons, twin-chained blades that burned with an inner fire that was distinctly not of the warp. Where demon flames were unnatural colors that hurt to perceive, these weapons blazed with the clean, honest fire of a forge or a hearth. They were tools of creation, repurposed for destruction, wielded by hands that had rebuilt as often as they had ruined. But it was the eyes that marked him as something beyond mortal ken. They held depths that spoke of losses so profound that they had carved away everything resembling hope, leaving only purpose. These were the eyes of someone who had stared into the abyss so long that he had become something the abyss itself feared to look upon. The bloodletters turned toward this new arrival with the reflexive aggression of their kind, ichor dripping from serrated blades, as they prepared to harvest another skull for their lord. They died before they could take a single step. The chained blades moved with a speed that defied human perception, carving through demonic flesh with contemptuous ease. More importantly, the wounds didn't heal. Where other weapons might banish lesser demons back to the warp to reform, these blades severed the connection between essence and form permanently. The bloodletters simply ended. Voss watched this impossible display through his magnoculars, his training warring with disbelief. In 30 years of service to the Emperor, he had seen Space Marines cleave through demon hordes and witnessed saints perform miracles that defied explanation. But this was different. This warrior fought with the casual efficiency of someone exterminating vermin, showing no strain or effort as he dismantled creatures that had required artillery strikes to slow. "Who is he?" whispered Corporal Thane from the foxhole beside him. Voss had no answer. Imperial records contained no mention of this pale giant with his burning blades. The Astartes did not fight with chained weapons, and no sanctioned psyker manifested fire that burned with such clean intensity. This warrior was an anomaly, a deviation from everything the Imperium understood about the nature of warfare against the ruinous powers. As if sensing their scrutiny, the figure turned toward the Imperial position. For a moment that stretched into eternity, those ancient eyes fixed on Voss through his scope. The Cadian felt as though he were being evaluated by something that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that had walked through fields of divine corpses and found them wanting. Then the warrior nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement between soldiers, and stepped back through the warp tear he had emerged from. The portal sealed itself with an audible crack, leaving behind only the rapidly decaying remains of the demon host and the lingering scent of smoke and ozone. Voss lowered his magnoculars with shaking hands, knowing that he had witnessed something that would reshape his understanding of the galaxy's fundamental nature. He was not alone in this revelation. Across the Imperium, similar encounters were being reported with increasing frequency. A pale warrior with burning blades, appearing wherever the forces of chaos pressed their advantage most severely. Each appearance resulted in the same outcome, total annihilation of the demonic host, with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Imperial commanders began referring to these incidents as cleansing events, though none could explain their origin or predict their occurrence. The Inquisition, naturally, took notice. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex of the Ordo Malleus had built her career on understanding the incomprehensible. She had catalogued demon species that existed only in theoretical mathematics, mapped warp currents that flowed backwards through time, and developed containment protocols for entities that technically didn't exist until they were observed. When reports began flooding in about an unknown warrior systematically dismantling chaos incursions, she made it her priority to understand this new variable. Her investigation led her to the sealed archives beneath the fortress of the Obsidian Mirror, where the Grey Knights maintained records deemed too dangerous for standard Imperial documentation. In a vault that required 17 different keys to open, she found a collection of data slates that should not have existed. The markings on them were older than the Imperium itself, predating even the dark age of technology by millennia. The record spoke of a time before humanity had learned to fear the gods, when other civilizations had risen and fallen beneath alien stars. They told of pantheons that had ruled over worlds now reduced to dust, of divine hierarchies that had seemed eternal until they weren't. Most importantly, they contained detailed accounts of something the ancient chroniclers had called the God Killer, a being that moved between realities like a natural force, ending divine reigns with the same casual inevitability as entropy. According to these impossible records, the God Killer was not native to any single reality, but moved between them like a wandering executioner, drawn to sites of divine corruption and cosmic imbalance. Where gods grew too proud, too cruel, or too removed from the mortals they claimed to protect, this entity would manifest to restore equilibrium through the simple expedient of permanent termination. Vex read these accounts with growing unease. If the records were accurate, and her psychic senses detected no trace of deception in their construction, then the Imperium was witnessing something unprecedented in its 10,000-year history. The God-Killer had come to their reality, and it had begun its work with the most obvious target. Khorne had been the strongest, the most straightforward in his malevolence. His domain was simple: kill, maim, burn. There were no subtle schemes to unravel, no complex psychic manipulations to navigate. The blood god's power came from raw, undiluted violence, which made him paradoxically the most vulnerable to someone who could simply be more violent than he was. The record suggested that this was merely the beginning. If the pattern held, if the God-Killer followed the same methodology it had employed across countless other realities, then 3 more divine executions were inevitable. Nurgle would fall next, his plagues proving useless against someone who had already endured every possible form of suffering. Tzeentch would follow, his schemes and manipulations crumbling before someone who fought with absolute directness. And finally, Slaanesh would face judgment, though the record suggested that encounter would be different. Vex closed the data slates and began preparing her report. The Imperium needed to know what was coming, even if they could do nothing to stop it. The God-Killer had entered their reality, and the cosmic order that had defined existence for 65 million years was about to change forever. In the depths of the warp, 3 remaining dark gods stirred uneasily in their domains, sensing a presence that did not belong, did not bend, and would not be turned aside. The war for the galaxy's soul had begun anew, and for the first time since their birth, the Chaos Gods found themselves genuinely afraid. The Garden of Nurgle had never known silence. For 65 million years, it had resonated with the constant drone of decay, the wet whisper of flesh returning to bone, the chittering of demon flies, the labored breathing of plague bearers as they tended to their grotesque crops. It was a symphony of entropy, beautiful in its inevitability, comforting in its promise that all things must eventually rot and return to the soil from which they came. Now, for the first time since the birth of despair itself, the garden trembled. Nurgle felt his brother's death like a physical wound. Khorne had been rage personified, the raw fury that drove mortals to tear at each other with tooth and claw when more sophisticated weapons failed them. His domain had been simple, pure, uncomplicated by the subtle manipulations that Tzeentch favored, or the exquisite torments that Slaanesh crafted with such artistry. Khorne had simply been as immutable as gravity, as eternal as entropy itself, until he wasn't. The Plague Father sat upon his throne of fossilized bone and watched the ripples of his brother's demise spread through the warp like cracks in reality's foundation. Across the galaxy, his children were reporting unprecedented phenomena. Plague outbreaks that had festered for centuries were simply ending. Not through imperial intervention or medical miracles, but through something far more fundamental. The diseases themselves were forgetting how to exist. On the hive world of Scintilla, a Nurgle's rot epidemic that had claimed 17 billion souls over the course of 200 years simply stopped. Infected citizens woke to find their festering wounds sealed, their bloated flesh returned to mortal proportions. More disturbing still, they retained no memory of their suffering. The psychological component of Nurgle's gifts, the acceptance of decay, the embrace of hopelessness, had been excised as thoroughly as the physical symptoms. Similar reports flooded in from demon worlds throughout the Eye of Terror. Plague-bearers found their carefully cultivated gardens withering not into the beautiful decay that was their purpose, but into sterile ash that supported no life whatsoever. The great unclean ones, Nurgle's most beloved children began to diminish as the fundamental concepts that sustained them — despair, acceptance of suffering, the comfort found in shared misery — simply evaporated from mortal consciousness. Nurgle understood, with the terrible clarity that came only to those about to face extinction, that his brother had not simply been killed. Khorne had been unmade, erased from the conceptual framework of reality with such thoroughness that even the memory of his influence was being systematically removed from the galaxy's collective consciousness. This was not merely death, it was ontological assassination. The implications terrified him in ways that the Plague Father had thought himself incapable of experiencing. In the material realm, the effects of this cosmic surgery were becoming increasingly visible to those with the knowledge to recognize them. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex stood in the sanctum of her flagship, the Eternal Vigil, surrounded by data slates and pict screens displaying reports from across the segmentum. Each transmission painted the same, impossible picture. The influence of chaos was diminishing in ways that defied every model the Imperium had developed over 10 millennia of warfare against the ruinous powers. "Show me the Mordian 7 incident again," she commanded her servo skull. "Logis 7. The mechanical familiar projected a hololithic recording captured by surveyors in the aftermath of the demon incursion, where previous chaos manifestations left lingering corruption that required decades of purification to cleanse. The battlefield showed no trace of warp taint whatsoever. The very air registered as pure on Auspex readings, cleaner than Terra's atmosphere had been since the Age of Strife. More significantly, the Imperial Guard regiment that had witnessed the Pale Warrior's intervention showed no signs of chaos exposure. Traditionally, even brief contact with greater demons left survivors with psychological scarring that manifested as nightmares, paranoia, and eventual madness. These soldiers displayed none of these symptoms. When questioned under psychic interrogation, they could recall the events with perfect clarity, but felt no residual trauma from their exposure to the warp's malevolent influence. It was as if the very concept of chaos corruption had been temporarily suspended in their vicinity. Vex had seen enough impossibilities in her career to recognize when she was witnessing something that operated by entirely different rules than those governing her reality. The God-Killer was not merely powerful. Power alone, no matter how immense, still operated within comprehensible parameters. This entity was something far more dangerous. It was change incarnate, a force that could rewrite the fundamental laws governing how spiritual warfare functioned in their universe. Her contemplation was interrupted by an urgent transmission from Astropath Prime Voldris. The aged Psyker's voice carried an undercurrent of barely contained terror as he delivered his report. "Inquisitor, we're receiving simultaneous distress calls from 17 different systems along the Cadian Gate. They're all reporting the same phenomenon. Spontaneous cessation of all Nurgle-related manifestations. Plague ships are going dark. Demon worlds are purifying themselves." Vex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental controls. "How long ago did these events begin?" "Approximately 6 hours ago, ma'am. They appear to be propagating outward from the Eye of Terror in a pattern consistent with hunting behavior." The Inquisitor closed her eyes and felt the weight of cosmic inevitability settling upon her shoulders. The God-Killer had begun its second hunt, and if the ancient records proved accurate, this engagement would be fundamentally different from the straightforward battle that had claimed Khorne. Nurgle was not merely the god of disease and decay, he was the embodiment of acceptance, of finding comfort in suffering, of the peculiar love that grew between those who shared in common misery. He would not go quietly into extinction. On the plague world of Bubonicus Prime, the first direct sighting of the God-Killer since Khorne's death sent shockwaves through the Traitor Legion forces stationed there. The Death Guard had turned the planet into a monument to their patron's generosity, transforming its cities into vast laboratories where new diseases could be cultivated and perfected. The population had been infected with over 300 distinct plagues, creating a living ecosystem of suffering that had sustained Nurgle's power for 8,000 years. Brother Captain Mortius had been observing the systematic failure of their patron's gifts when the Pale Warrior materialized in the center of their fortress monastery. Unlike his previous appearances, which had been brief and surgical in their precision, this manifestation seemed almost curious. The god-killer stood motionless for several minutes, his ancient eyes surveying the Gothic architecture that had been twisted into organic curves by centuries of warp influence. When he finally moved, it was with the same devastating efficiency that had characterized his assault on Khorne's forces. But there was something different in his manner. Where the blood god's servants had been destroyed with the simple brutality of a smith hammering hot iron, Nurgle's children faced something more complex. The chained blades carved through their diseased flesh. But the god-killer paused after each kill, watching as the plague-infused bodies did not decay in the traditional manner. Instead, they simply healed. The corruption that had sustained them for millennia was burned away by those impossible flames, leaving behind the bodies they had possessed before their fall to chaos. For just a moment, each Death Guard Astartes was restored to the proud warrior he had been before despair and disease had claimed him. Then they died, not from violence, but from the simple shock of remembering what they had lost. Mortius watched this impossible display from the dubious safety of his command throne, his voxcaster filled with the confused screams of his battle brothers as they experienced emotions they hadn't felt in 8,000 years. Fear, hope, regret. The psychological architecture that Nurgle's gifts had imposed upon them, the acceptance of decay, the comfort found in shared suffering, was being systematically dismantled, leaving raw souls exposed to the full weight of their choices. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice distorted by the respirator that had kept him alive since his transformation. The god-killer turned toward him, and Mortius felt those ancient eyes looking not at his corrupted flesh, but at something deeper, something that he had buried beneath centuries of despair and had almost forgotten existed. "I am what remains when everything else is taken away," the warrior replied, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions Mortius could not name. "And you are not yet beyond redemption." The chained blade moved with surgical precision, severing not flesh but the spiritual bonds that chained the Death Guard captain to his patron. Mortius felt Nurgle's influence drain from his body like poison from a wound, leaving behind sensations he had not experienced in millennia. Clean air filling unobstructed lungs, the absence of constant pain, the ability to feel something other than resignation and decay. He also felt the weight of 8,000 years of atrocities settling upon his conscience like a mountain of bones. "The choice is yours," the god-killer continued, stepping over the rapidly healing bodies of the fallen Death Guard. "You can carry this burden and seek to make amends, or you can let it crush you. But you will make that choice with a clear mind, free from the comforting lies your God has whispered to you." Mortius tried to respond, but his voice failed him. For the first time since his fall to chaos, he was faced with the full scope of what he had become, what he had done, and what he had allowed to be done in his name. The psychological framework that had made such horrors bearable, Nurgle's promise that suffering was universal and therefore meaningless, had been stripped away, leaving only the raw truth of his choices. The god-killer walked past him without another word, heading deeper into the fortress, where the true architects of this world's misery waited. Mortius remained frozen on his command throne, watching through security feeds as the Pale Warrior systematically dismantled every plague laboratory, every torture chamber, every monument to decay that his legion had constructed over 8 millennia. But unlike Khorne's servants, who had simply ceased to exist, the Death Guard were being given something far more terrible and precious: the opportunity to remember who they had been before they fell, and to choose who they wanted to become afterward. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out, as the God Killer moved through Nurgle's domain with methodical precision. Each encounter followed the same pattern: violent purification, followed by an offer of redemption that many found more terrifying than simple destruction. In the Garden of Nurgle, the Plague Father felt each severed connection like a physical amputation. His children were not merely dying, they were being offered the chance to reject him, to turn away from the comfort he provided and face the universe's cruelties without the buffer of his gifts. And they were choosing to do so. For the first time in his existence, Nurgle began to understand what his brother had faced in his final moments. This was not simply another enemy to be fought and overcome through superior force or cunning strategy. This was judgment incarnate, offering his children something he had never been able to provide: the possibility of genuine choice. The garden trembled again, and this time the sound was not silence, but something far worse: the first notes of genuine hope beginning to bloom where despair had reigned for eons uncounted. The heart of decay had been Nurgle's greatest triumph, a realm within the warp where entropy itself achieved a kind of terrible beauty. Here, in the deepest reaches of the garden, the Plague Father had cultivated his masterwork, a perfect ecosystem of rot and renewal, where death gave birth to new forms of life in an endless cycle of transformation. Diseases that had claimed billions of souls across the galaxy gestated here in crystalline pools, tended by demon gardeners who sang lullabies to plagues as they matured. It was here that Nurgle chose to make his stand. The God-Killer's approach had been methodical, almost leisurely by the standards of divine warfare. Where Khorne had raged and threatened as his domain collapsed around him, Nurgle had watched with something approaching scientific curiosity as his influence systematically evaporated from the material realm. Each severed connection, each purified world, each redeemed follower provided data points in an equation the Plague Father was desperately trying to solve. How did one fight an enemy who offered his victims something he himself could not provide? The question plagued him, a bitter irony that was not lost on the God of Plagues, as he prepared for the confrontation that would determine not merely his survival, but the fundamental nature of despair itself. Nurgle had always understood that his power came not from the diseases he spread, but from the resignation they engendered, the acceptance of suffering that allowed mortals to find comfort in shared misery. Remove that psychological foundation, and his entire conceptual framework crumbled like a house built on infected ground. Yet as the God-Killer stepped into the heart of decay, Nurgle felt something he had not experienced in 65 million years: genuine curiosity. This warrior did not radiate the mindless fury that had defined Khorne, nor did he show any sign of the revulsion that typically gripped mortals when faced with decay's majesty. Instead, he moved through the garden with the same measured pace he had displayed throughout his campaign, his ancient eyes cataloguing each horror with the detachment of a scholar studying particularly interesting specimens. "You are not what I expected," Nurgle rumbled, his voice causing pustules to bloom on the crystalline formations around them. The Plague Father stood at the heart of his domain, a mountain of diseased flesh that had long ago transcended any single form. He was entropy personified, beautiful in his grotesqueness, terrible in his unconditional love for all forms of decay. The God-Killer paused in his advance, the blades of chaos hanging loose at his sides. "What did you expect?" Rage, perhaps. Disgust, certainly. The usual responses when mortals encounter truths their minds cannot process. Nurgle's laughter was the sound of 1,000 plagues finding new hosts. "But you look upon my garden, and I see no judgment in your eyes. No revulsion, only understanding. I have seen entropy before, Kratos replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the Diamond Gardeners wither in their positions. I have watched civilizations crumble, seen gods reduced to ash, felt my own body fail and rebuild itself countless times. Your domain is beautiful in its way. But beauty does not excuse the suffering you have caused in its creation. Nurgle leaned forward, his massive bulk causing the ground to crack and ooze with psychic pressure. Suffering? Child, I end suffering. Every plague I send, every disease I craft, every moment of despair I nurture, all of it serves to teach mortals the fundamental truth of existence, that pain shared is pain diminished. I offer them release from the burden of hope. You offer them lies wrapped in pretty words, the god-killer countered, taking another step forward. The crystalline pools began to steam as his presence intensified. I know what it means to lose everything. I have felt despair so profound that I welcomed death as a mercy. But I also know that choosing to endure, choosing to fight, even when victory seems impossible, that is what makes existence meaningful. The Plague Father's expression shifted, confusion rippling across his diseased features. You speak of meaning as though it exists independent of suffering, as though mortals could find purpose without first accepting the futility of their struggles. Meaning is not found in acceptance of futility, Kratos said, raising the blades of chaos. The weapons blazed with clean fire that burned away the garden's sickly miasma. It is forged in the refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. Nurgle rose to his full height, towering above the god-killer like a mountain of living decay. For the first time in millions of years, he felt something approaching anger, not the clean fury that had defined his brother Khorne, but a deeper, more complex emotion, born from having his fundamental worldview challenged by someone who clearly understood suffering as intimately as he did. Then let me show you the truth of mortal existence, he bellowed, raising his staff. Let me share with you the diseases that have claimed civilizations, the despair that has driven entire species to extinction. See how long your philosophy survives when you carry the weight of every plague I have ever crafted. The attack that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed. Where Khorne had relied on brute force and overwhelming aggression, Nurgle employed the accumulated misery of 65 million years. Diseases that existed only in theoretical mathematics manifested around Kratos, plagues that attacked not flesh but hope itself, despair given form and purpose. The god-killer met them head-on. Where the plagues touched his flesh, they found no purchase. Where despair sought to take root in his mind, it encountered something harder than adamantium, the absolute certainty of someone who had already endured the worst suffering the universe could offer and chosen to continue fighting anyway. Each disease, each moment of engineered despair, simply ended. Not defeated, not overcome, but transformed into something else entirely. The transformation was terrible to witness. As each plague died against Kratos' flesh, it released the suffering it had contained, not back into the warp where it could feed Nurgle's power, but into clean emptiness where it could dissipate harmlessly. Millions of years of accumulated anguish simply evaporated, leaving behind a silence that was not peaceful, but absolute. Nurgle felt each release like a physical amputation. His carefully cultivated gardens began to wither, not into beautiful decay, but into sterile ash. The demon gardeners collapsed as the conceptual framework that sustained them, the beauty found in entropy, the love discovered in shared suffering, simply ceased to exist in their vicinity. Impossible, he whispered, his voice no longer causing flowers of plague to bloom. Suffering cannot simply end. It transforms, it spreads, it finds new hosts, but it cannot simply stop existing. It can, Kratos replied, advancing steadily through the collapsing garden. I learned that truth 10,000 years ago, when I chose to stop being a victim of my own rage. Suffering ends when someone chooses to end it, even if that choice costs them everything. The blades of chaos carved through Nurgle's bulk with surgical precision, but the wounds did not suppurate or heal in the traditional sense. Instead, they simply closed, leaving behind flesh that was neither diseased nor healthy, but somehow clean of any influence save existence itself. Each cut severed another connection between the Plague Father and the mortals who had found comfort in his gifts, freeing them to choose their own relationship with suffering. Nurgle felt his consciousness fragmenting as the fundamental concepts that defined him were systematically edited from reality's source code. He was not dying in any conventional sense. He was being unmade, erased from the cosmic equation with the same thoroughness that had claimed his brother. But unlike Khorne, who had raged against extinction until the very end, Nurgle found himself experiencing something unprecedented, genuine gratitude. "I understand now," he said, his voice growing fainter as his essence continued to dissipate. "You do not destroy, you liberate. You free my children from the comfort I provided, so they can discover what comfort they might create for themselves." Kratos paused in his advance, the blades of chaos momentarily still. "Did you think I took pleasure in this?" I hoped you might. It would have made this easier to bear." Nurgle's form was dissolving now, returning to the raw warp stuff from which it had been born eons ago. "But you carry each necessity like a burden, don't you? Each god you unmake, each power you strip from the universe. You do it not because you want to, but because it must be done." The god-killer said nothing, but something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Tell me," Nurgle continued, his voice now barely a whisper. "When this is finished, when all four of us are gone, and the galaxy is free from our influence, what will you do with the silence that remains?" Kratos looked out across the dissolving garden, watching as eons of carefully cultivated decay simply stopped. "I will find something else that needs to end." "Even yourself?" The question hung in the air between them as Nurgle's form finally lost cohesion entirely, dispersing into motes of light that gradually faded from perception. The heart of decay collapsed into itself, leaving behind a void that was not empty, but somehow expectant, as though waiting for something new to grow in the space where entropy had once reigned supreme. The god-killer stood alone in the silence, his scarred features reflecting the weight of cosmic necessity. In the distance, he could feel the stirring of the two remaining dark gods, Tzeentch, already beginning to weave schemes within schemes to avoid his brother's fate, and Slaanesh, watching with predatory interest to see how this unprecedented drama might unfold. The war was far from over. But for the first time since it had begun, Kratos allowed himself to wonder what victory might actually cost. Not in terms of effort or sacrifice, but in terms of the silence that would remain when all the gods were gone and only mortals were left to face the universe's indifference without divine buffers to soften its harsh truths. Across the galaxy, the second great silence fell, where Khorne's death had been marked by the absence of rage. Nurgle's passing left behind something far more complex, the sudden, terrifying freedom of billions of souls who would now have to discover for themselves what comfort meant without a god to provide it for them. In the depths of the crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch felt his brother's dissolution and began to laugh, not with the manic glee that typically characterized the changer of ways, but with the genuine appreciation of someone who had just witnessed a move so elegant that it redefined the entire game. The god-killer had revealed his true strategy, and it was far more dangerous than simple destruction. He was teaching the galaxy what it meant to be free. The question was whether the galaxy could survive the lesson. The crystal labyrinth had not been built. It had grown, like a cancer of pure possibility, expanding through dimensions that existed only in the spaces between certainty and doubt. For millions of years, it had served as Tzeentch's greatest work of art, a maze where every path led to a different version of reality, and every choice spawned 1,000 new possibilities. Here, in the realm where change itself was given architectural form, the Changer of Ways had woven plots within plots, schemes so complex that they spanned millennia and encompassed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Now, for the first time since its creation, the labyrinth was perfectly still. Tzeentch sat upon his throne of contemplation, a structure that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, its form shifting between states of matter that had no names in any mortal language. The great conspirator's mind, that vast engine of calculation that could process 1 billion possible futures in the span of a heartbeat, had focused itself entirely upon a single, impossible problem. How did one outmaneuver someone who refused to play by the rules of the game? The deaths of his brothers had provided invaluable data. Khorne had faced the God Killer with straightforward violence and been overwhelmed by superior force applied with absolute precision. Nurgle had attempted philosophical discourse and been undone by someone who understood suffering more intimately than the Plague Father himself. Both approaches had failed because they had operated under the assumption that this entity could be comprehended within existing frameworks. Tzeentch was beginning to suspect that this assumption was fundamentally flawed. "Show me again," he commanded, his voice causing the crystalline walls to resonate with harmonics that existed in frequencies beyond mortal perception. The air before him shimmered, displaying the final moments of Nurgle's dissolution. Tzeentch watched with the analytical detachment of a scholar studying particularly interesting specimens as his brother's form lost cohesion, dispersing into motes of light that gradually faded from perception. But it was the God-Killer's expression that held the Changer's attention, that moment of almost imperceptible softening when Nurgle had spoken of burdens and necessity. "Fascinating," Tzeentch murmured, his form cycling through a dozen different configurations as his mind processed the implications. He does not desire this. Each god he unmakes diminishes him as well. He is not a destroyer seeking power. He is an executioner carrying out a sentence he did not write. The revelation should have been comforting. An enemy driven by duty rather than ambition was theoretically predictable, bound by codes and limitations that could be exploited. But Tzeentch had not survived 65 million years by underestimating opponents, and something about the God-Killer's absolute commitment to his grim task triggered warnings in the deepest recesses of the Changer's consciousness. This was not mere duty. This was something far more dangerous. Acceptance of cosmic necessity, combined with the will to see it through, regardless of personal cost. In the material realm, the effects of the second divine death were propagating across the galaxy like ripples on a pond made of space-time itself. Where Khorne's destruction had ended rage-driven conflicts, Nurgle's dissolution was having far more complex consequences. Billions of souls who had found comfort in shared suffering suddenly found themselves forced to confront their pain without divine buffers to soften its impact. On the forge world of Metallica, servo-skull operators who had accepted their transformation into near-mindless drones as Nurgle's gift of release from consciousness suddenly remembered what it meant to think, to dream, to hope for something better than mere existence. The psychological shock killed half of them within the first day, but those who survived began to question everything they had accepted about their place in the Imperium's hierarchy. Similar upheavals were occurring throughout imperial space. Plague worlds that had wallowed in despair for millennia suddenly found their populations capable of imagining alternatives to their suffering. The results were not always pleasant. Hope, when introduced to minds that had known only despair, could be as destructive as any disease. But they were undeniably transformative. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex observed these changes from her flagship's command throne, surrounded by data streams that painted an increasingly incomprehensible picture of galactic transformation. Her Ordo Malleus training had prepared her for many forms of chaos corruption, but nothing in imperial doctrine addressed what to do when chaos influence simply ceased to exist. "Ma'am," reported Astropath Prime Valdris, his voice tight with barely controlled confusion, "we're receiving reports of spontaneous imperial cult revivals across 17 sectors. Populations that have worshipped disease and decay for millennia are converting back to the imperial creed without any missionary intervention." Vex felt a chill that had nothing to do with her ship's environmental systems. "What kind of conversion rates are we seeing?" "Sector-wide, Ma'am. Entire planetary populations. They're remembering what they believed before they fell to chaos, and they're angry about what they allowed themselves to become." The implications were staggering. The God-Killer was not merely destroying chaos influence, he was reversing it, stripping away layers of corruption to reveal what had existed before. It was psychological archaeology on a cosmic scale, excavating buried aspects of human nature that had been suppressed by millennia of divine manipulation. More disturbing still were the reports filtering in from the Eye of Terror itself. Scout ships equipped with the most advanced warp shielding the Mechanicus could devise were reporting something unprecedented. Sections of the Eye were stabilizing. Regions of space-time that had been twisted beyond recognition by chaos influence were slowly returning to baseline reality configurations. If the pattern continued, if the God-Killer succeeded in his apparent mission to unmake all 4 dark gods, the fundamental nature of the galaxy would be transformed beyond recognition. Humanity would be freed from the influence of the ruinous powers, but they would also be forced to confront the universe's indifference without divine scapegoats to blame for their choices. In the Crystal Labyrinth, Tzeentch was reaching similar conclusions through very different methodologies. "He seeks to free them," the Changer of Ways mused, his form settling temporarily into something resembling a giant raven composed of living mathematics. Not from us specifically, but from the very concept of divine influence over mortal affairs. He would leave them alone, truly alone, for the first time since consciousness began dreaming gods into existence. The prospect filled him with something approaching admiration. It was, he had to admit, an elegant solution to the problem of cosmic horror. If mortals created gods through their fears, desires, and desperate need for meaning in a universe that offered none, then the simplest way to end divine tyranny was to remove the gods entirely and force mortals to find meaning for themselves. But Tzeentch had not become the architect of fate by accepting elegant solutions at face value. "The flaw in your reasoning, God-Killer," he said to the empty air, knowing somehow that his words would reach their intended target across impossible distances, "is that you assume mortals want to be free. But freedom is terrifying. Choice is a burden. Most beings would rather serve a tyrant than accept responsibility for their own existence." As if summoned by his words, reality tore itself apart with surgical precision, and the pale warrior stepped through the dimensional breach into the heart of the Crystal Labyrinth. But where his previous manifestations had been straightforward, appearing in a location and proceeding directly to his target, this entrance was different. The God-Killer paused at the threshold, his ancient eyes studying the impossible architecture with something approaching caution. "Interesting," Tzeentch observed, rising from his throne with fluid grace. "My brother's domains were static, defined by single concepts that could be confronted directly. But you find yourself in a realm where the very act of observation changes what is being observed. Every step you take spawns new possibilities. Every choice eliminates infinite alternatives. How do you destroy something that exists in a state of constant transformation?" Kratos raised the blades of chaos. But for the first time since beginning his campaign against the dark gods, the weapon's flames flickered with uncertainty. The crystalline passages around him shifted in response to his movement, creating new paths while sealing off others. The labyrinth was not simply a location, it was a living equation, a mathematical representation of pure change given architectural form. You cannot burn away possibility itself, Tzeentch continued, his form beginning to multiply as the space between them expanded to accommodate infinite potential configurations. You cannot cut through concepts. I am not what I am. I am what I might become, what I could have been, what I will be in futures that may never exist. How do you kill something that has never truly lived? The god-killer took a step forward, and the path beneath his feet immediately branched into 17 different routes, each leading to a different version of the confrontation that was about to unfold. In one, he charged directly at Tzeentch with blazing weapons. In another, he turned and walked away, somehow recognizing the futility of the challenge. In a third, he knelt and offered his service to the Changer of Ways in exchange for knowledge that could prevent some greater catastrophe. All possibilities existed simultaneously until the moment of choice collapsed them into singular reality. I see, Kratos said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that made the crystalline walls ring like bells. You think this is a game where the rules matter? Tzeentch felt a flicker of unease. Is it not? Everything is a game, God-killer. Every interaction is a contest of will and intelligence. Every conflict a puzzle to be solved through superior strategy. Even now, you stand at a crossroads of infinite possibility. Choose wisely, and you might find a path that leads to victory. Choose poorly, and you will wander my domain until entropy claims the last star. The god-killer smiled, and for the first time since his brothers had begun dying, Tzeentch felt genuine fear. I am not here to play your game, Kratos replied, raising the blades of chaos. But instead of striking at Tzeentch directly, he drove them into the floor of the labyrinth itself, their flames spreading through the crystalline structure like cracks in reality's foundation. I am here to end it. The blades did not burn away possibility. They burned away the need for possibility to exist at all. Where their flames touched the crystal labyrinth, the elaborate architecture of change and potential simply stopped. Not destroyed, not transformed, but rendered irrelevant by the introduction of something that existed outside the framework of cosmic games entirely. Tzeentch watched in growing horror as his greatest work began to dissolve around him, not into chaos, but into a kind of terrible clarity that admitted no alternatives, no schemes, no escape routes through alternative realities. For the first time in 65 million years, the Changer of Ways was faced with a single, inescapable possibility, that his existence was about to end, and no amount of cleverness could alter that fundamental truth. The game was over. It had been over from the moment the God-Killer decided it would end. And in that moment of perfect understanding, Tzeentch began to laugh, not with mockery or madness, but with the genuine appreciation of someone who had finally encountered a move so elegant that it transcended the very concept of strategy itself. The death of possibility itself was not loud. There was no cosmic scream, no reality-shaking explosion, no final defiant curse echoing across dimensions. When Tzeentch began to dissolve, he did so with the quiet dignity of mathematics being corrected, of equations finding their proper balance after eons of deliberate miscalculation. The crystal labyrinth collapsed inward, its impossible architecture folding through dimensions that ceased to exist the moment they were no longer needed to support the Changer's schemes. Pathways that had stretched across eternity contracted to single points. Halls that had contained infinite possibilities reduced themselves to empty space. The great work of art that had housed 1,000,000 plots within plots simply simplified. Kratos stood at the center of this cosmic reduction, the blades of chaos no longer burning with their usual intensity. The weapons hung at his sides, their flames dimmed to barely perceptible embers, as their wielder watched 65 million years of accumulated schemes dissolve into irrelevance. For all his protests about games and rules, Tzeentch had accepted his dissolution with something approaching relief, as though the burden of infinite possibility had finally proven too heavy to bear. "You understand now," the changer of ways had whispered in his final moments, his form cycling through every configuration he had ever worn before, settling into something almost recognizably human. This was never about power or survival. You offer something none of us could provide. An ending, a genuine conclusion to stories that were never meant to finish. The God-Killer had said nothing in reply. What response could be adequate to a truth so fundamental? He was not a destroyer or conqueror. He was entropy's answer to immortals who had forgotten how to die gracefully, cosmic punctuation for sentences that had run on too long. Now he stood alone in the space where the crystal labyrinth had been, surrounded by the kind of perfect vacuum that existed only in the deepest reaches of space between stars. No scheming voices whispered from hidden alcoves. No paths branched toward alternative futures. There was only the silence of resolved equations and the weight of necessity completed. The third great silence fell across the galaxy like a curtain made of exhausted possibility. On Terra, in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, servo skulls that had been calculating probability matrices for 10,000 years simply stopped. Not due to malfunction or power failure, but because the fundamental concept of alternative outcomes had temporarily ceased to exist in their vicinity. The Adeptus Administratum, that vast bureaucracy, which had spent millennia generating paperwork for scenarios that might never occur, found their scribes staring at blank parchments as their minds struggled to comprehend a universe where the future was not a branching tree of possibilities, but a single, inevitable progression toward whatever came next. The effects rippled outward from Terra like stones cast into still water. Astropaths who had spent centuries parsing the chaotic signals of the warp for glimpses of possible futures found their gift transformed into something simpler and more direct. They could no longer perceive what might happen, only what was happening, in perfect clarity, without the comforting buffer of uncertainty to soften harsh truths. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex experienced this change as a physical sensation, like a migraine, suddenly lifting to reveal that the pain had been masking a deeper clarity all along. Her psychic abilities, normally a constant susurrus of whispered possibilities and half-glimpsed alternatives, had been reduced to a single, crystal-clear channel of perception. She saw the galaxy as it actually was, without the distorting lens of Tzeentchian influence. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. Chaos corruption, which had always been a shifting, mutable thing that adapted and evolved to resist imperial countermeasures, had become static, predictable, vulnerable in ways that the Ordo Malleus had never dreamed possible. Cults that had survived for millennia by changing their doctrines and methods whenever discovery threatened, found themselves locked into single patterns of behavior, unable to adapt or evolve. But the same stability that made chaos corruption vulnerable also made imperial responses more brittle. Commanders who had built their careers on anticipating enemy adaptations suddenly found themselves commanding forces trained to fight an enemy that no longer changed, against threats that no longer shifted to exploit tactical weaknesses. The galaxy was becoming a place where causes led directly to effects, where actions had consequences that could be calculated rather than guessed at, where the future was determined by choices made in the present rather than by the whims of cosmic manipulators pulling strings from beyond mortal perception. It should have been a blessing. Instead, it felt like being forced to walk a tightrope without a safety net, knowing that every step mattered in ways that had never been true when divine intervention could alter the rules without warning. In the webway, the remnants of the Eldar race felt Tzeentch's passing, like the sudden absence of a migraine they had carried for millions of years. The paths that governed their society, those rigid behavioral frameworks designed to prevent emotional extremes from feeding the chaos gods, suddenly seemed less necessary, less urgent. For the first time since the fall of their empire, individual Eldar began to experience moments of genuine spontaneity, free from the terror that any strong emotion might attract the attention of she who thirsts. But even as they celebrated this unexpected freedom, the more perceptive among them recognized the approaching shadow of the final confrontation. 3 of the dark gods were gone, their influence severed from reality with surgical precision. Only one remained, and her response to the God-Killer's campaign would be unlike anything her brothers had attempted. Slaanesh was not raging like Khorne, or seeking understanding like Nurgle, or attempting to outmaneuver like Tzeentch. She was planning to seduce. In the Palace of Pleasure, that impossible realm where sensation was given architectural form and desire shaped the very air into intoxicating vapors, the Dark Prince of Chaos sat upon her throne of crystallized screams and smiled. Where her brothers had seen an enemy to be fought, or a problem to be solved, she recognized something far more interesting. An opportunity. The God-Killer was alone. He had been alone for so long that solitude had become his natural state, a psychological fortress that protected him from the kind of connections that could be exploited or corrupted. But solitude, no matter how complete, always carried within it the seed of its own dissolution. Everyone, eventually, wanted something they could not provide for themselves. She had watched his campaign against her brothers with growing fascination, studying not just his methods, but his reactions, the micro-expressions that crossed his scarred features when he thought no one was observing. The God-Killer carried his burdens with stoic determination, but burdens by their very nature were things that souls longed to set down, if only temporarily. And Slaanesh was the undisputed master of giving souls exactly what they thought they wanted, until they discovered that the price of desire fulfilled was always higher than they had imagined. "Come to me, God-Killer," she whispered, her voice carrying across impossible distances to reach ears that had heard the death songs of pantheons. "Let us discuss terms. You have proven your power beyond any doubt. Now let me show you something infinitely more valuable, the possibility of rest." The offer rippled through the warp like perfume through still air, carrying with it promises that were not lies so much as carefully curated truths. Rest from the burden of cosmic necessity. Peace from the weight of eternal struggle. The simple pleasure of laying down weapons that had grown too heavy to lift, if only for a moment. In the void where Tzeentch's realm had been, Kratos felt the invitation like a whisper at the edge of hearing. His grip on the blades of chaos tightened reflexively, ancient instincts recognizing a trap even as his consciousness acknowledged the seductive appeal of what was being offered. He had been fighting for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to want something other than the ending of whatever needed to end next. The promise of even temporary respite was tempting. More tempting than it should have been, given his accumulated experience with divine offers that came without price. But temptation was precisely what made Slaanesh different from her brothers, and what made the final confrontation the most dangerous of all. She would not attack his body like Khorne, or his hope like Nurgle, or his certainty like Tzeentch. She would attack something far more fundamental, his will to continue a campaign that had already cost him more than any victory could possibly be worth. The God-Killer closed his eyes, and felt the weight of 3 divine deaths settling upon his shoulders like chains made of hardened starlight. Each ending had diminished him, not through injury or exhaustion, but through the simple arithmetic of loss. Every god he unmade left the universe a little emptier, a little more silent, a little more dependent on mortal choices to provide meaning in a cosmos that offered none naturally. When he opened his eyes again, they held the flat certainty of someone who had counted the cost and chosen to pay it anyway. "I accept your invitation," he said to the empty void, knowing his words would reach their intended recipient. "But not for the reasons you hope." Slaanesh's laughter echoed across dimensions, beautiful and terrible and filled with genuine delight. The Dark Prince had played this game for millions of years, tempting mortals and immortals alike with promises tailored to their deepest desires. She had never lost, because she had never encountered someone whose greatest desire was for desire itself to end. This would be interesting. The final movement of the cosmic symphony was about to begin, and for the first time since the war started, neither participant was entirely certain of the outcome. The God-Killer possessed absolute determination and weapons that could unmake divine essence itself. The Dark Prince commanded every form of temptation that conscious beings could experience, and understood better than anyone how to transform strength into weakness through the simple expedient of offering someone exactly what they thought they needed most. The galaxy held its breath, suspended between the possibility of freedom and the seductive comfort of beautiful chains. In the distance, reality began to reshape itself around the anticipation of desires that had never been spoken aloud, preparing to host a confrontation between ending and eternity, between the will to finish and the compulsion to continue, between someone who sought to close the book and someone who promised that the story never had to end. The fourth and final silence was coming, but it would not arrive easily. The Palace of Pleasure defied every architectural principle that mortal minds could comprehend. Its walls were constructed from crystallized size, its floors polished to mirror brightness with the tears of beings who had experienced perfect ecstasy. Corridors stretched in directions that existed only in the space between desire and fulfillment, while chambers opened onto vistas of impossible beauty designed to make observers forget that they had ever wanted to be anywhere else. It was, in every sense, a place designed to trap souls in the amber of their own longings. When the God-Killer stepped across the threshold between realities, he found himself standing in a hall that seemed to breathe with anticipation. The very air shimmered with half-glimpsed possibilities, each more enticing than the last. Phantom sensations drifted through the atmosphere, the touch of lovers long lost, the taste of foods that existed only in memory, the sound of laughter from children who had never been born, but might have been, given different choices. Slaanesh had prepared her domain with exquisite care, crafting temptations as precisely as a master jeweler setting precious stones. Every surface reflected not what Kratos was, but what he might become if he allowed himself to lay down the burden of cosmic necessity. Every shadow held glimpses of the man he had been before gods and wars had carved away everything resembling ordinary human desire. "Welcome, God-Killer," came a voice, like honey poured over broken glass, beautiful enough to make mortal hearts stop, and dangerous enough to shatter souls that listened too closely. "I have been waiting for you with such anticipation." Slaanesh materialized from the palace's living architecture, her form shifting between configurations as her consciousness sampled different approaches to the challenge before her. She had worn countless faces over the eons, beautiful beyond description, terrible beyond imagining, and everything in between. But for this encounter, she chose something simpler. Human, or close enough to human, that ancient memories might stir in response to familiar features. She appeared as a woman of indeterminate age, beautiful without being overwhelming, familiar without being specific. Her eyes held depths that reflected whatever the observer most desired to see there, and her smile carried the promise of understanding that few souls ever found in their actual lives. "You are not what I expected," Kratos said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had learned not to trust divine hospitality, no matter how appealingly packaged. "Expectations are limitations," Slaanesh replied, gesturing toward a table that materialized from crystallized desire. Upon its surface sat simple provisions: bread, wine, fruits that looked freshly picked from trees that had never existed. "I prefer to offer what is needed rather than what is anticipated. Please sit. Rest. You have carried your burdens for such a long time." The God-Killer remained standing, the blades of chaos held loose at his sides, but ready to ignite at the first sign of deception. Yet he could not deny the appeal of what she offered. After 3 divine executions, his body ached with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The weight of cosmic necessity had settled into his bones like lead, and the prospect of even temporary relief was tempting, more tempting than it should have been. "What do you want?" he asked, recognizing that the question itself was a form of engagement, the first step down a path he had not intended to walk. Slaanesh's smile deepened, and for a moment her carefully chosen human facade flickered, revealing glimpses of something vast and hungry beneath. "What do I want?" An interesting question, coming from someone who has spent eternity defined by what he must do rather than what he desires. When did you last want something, Kratos? When did you last choose to act from preference rather than necessity? The question hit with unexpected force, penetrating defenses he had not realized he was maintaining. When had he last made a choice based on desire rather than duty? When had he last considered what he wanted, independent of what the universe required him to do? The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. He could not remember. "I see the understanding in your eyes," Slaanesh continued, moving closer with fluid grace that seemed to make the air itself more pleasant to breathe. "You have become so focused on ending that you have forgotten how to begin, so committed to necessary destruction that you have lost sight of what creation might feel like. When did you last build something instead of tearing it down?" She gestured, and the palace around them shifted, showing glimpses of other possibilities. Visions of the god-killer setting down his weapons, finding peace in mortal relationships, discovering what it meant to live for something other than cosmic duty. The images were carefully crafted, appealing without being obvious, seductive in their very restraint. "I could give you that," she whispered, her voice now close enough to feel against his ear. "Not forever. I am not cruel enough to trap you in paradise when the universe still needs your services. But for a time. Long enough to remember what you fight to preserve. Long enough to understand why existence might be worth continuing." Kratos felt something he had not experienced in millennia. Genuine temptation. Not the crude desire for power or revenge that had driven him in earlier ages, but something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. The promise of rest, of choice, of remembering what it felt like to want something that was not another ending to another cosmic threat. "What would be the price?" he asked, recognizing even as he spoke that asking about price implied he was considering the offer seriously. Slaanesh's eyes gleamed with triumph, so brief it might have been imagined. "No price, no bargain, no contract written in blood or souls. Simply acceptance. Allow yourself to want something other than duty for once in your existence. Let me show you pleasures you have denied yourself in service to necessity. Discover what you might become if you were free to choose your own path rather than walking the one carved out by cosmic inevitability." The offer was masterfully constructed, appealing to desires so deeply buried that Kratos had almost forgotten they existed. The promise of agency, of choosing his own purpose rather than being driven by forces beyond his control. The possibility of existing for himself rather than as a tool of universal correction. It should have been irresistible. It would have been irresistible to almost anyone else who had carried such burdens for so long. But Slaanesh had made a fundamental error in her calculations, and that error would prove to be the greatest mistake any god had ever made. She had offered him what she thought he wanted, based on her understanding of desire and need, and the psychology of beings who craved relief from suffering. But her analysis had been flawed from the beginning, corrupted by assumptions that applied to every other soul she had encountered over millions of years, but did not apply to the god-killer. Kratos did not want rest. He did not desire freedom from duty. He did not crave the ability to choose his own path. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, since that day when his own hands had first been stained with the blood of innocents, was to earn the right to stop existing entirely. Every god he unmade, every cosmic threat he eliminated, every burden he accepted, brought him closer to a universe that no longer required his intervention. His deepest desire was not for pleasure or rest or agency, but for the moment when the universe would finally be safe enough that he could lay down his weapons and simply end. And by offering him temporary respite from that quest, by attempting to delay or divert him from his ultimate goal, Slaanesh had revealed that she fundamentally misunderstood what drove him. "I see the truth now," he said quietly, raising the blades of chaos. The weapons ignited with flames that burned away illusion and pretense, revealing the palace of pleasure for what it truly was, a magnificent cage designed to hold souls who had forgotten why they wanted to be free. "You think this is about what I want?" Slaanesh felt the first tremor of genuine uncertainty, her carefully crafted human facade flickering as her true nature began to assert itself in response to unexpected threat. "Is it not? Every being desires something. Every soul can be tempted if the offer is perfectly calibrated to their deepest needs." "You are correct," Kratos replied, advancing with the steady inevitability of entropy itself. "I do desire something. I desire for you to no longer exist, so that mortals can discover for themselves what pleasure means when it is not filtered through divine corruption. I desire for the universe to be free from the influence of beings who mistake their own appetites for universal truth." The Dark Prince felt her domain beginning to tremble as something she had not encountered in millions of years pressed against the foundations of her reality. Genuine rejection of everything she represented, offered by someone who understood temptation intimately, but chose duty anyway. "But I offer you choice," she protested, her voice losing its honey-sweet quality as desperation crept in around the edges. "Freedom from the burden of cosmic responsibility, the ability to live for yourself rather than for universal necessity." "And that," Kratos said, his weapons carving through the crystallized sighs that formed her palace walls, "is precisely why you must end. You see freedom as the absence of duty, pleasure as the opposite of purpose. You would teach mortals to live only for themselves, to pursue desire without consideration for consequence or cost." The flames of the blades of chaos spread through the palace of pleasure like wildfire, but they did not burn away beauty or joy or the capacity for happiness. Instead, they burned away the compulsion that made such things addictive, the divine influence that transformed natural desires into chains of dependency. For the first time since her birth, from the psychic scream of a dying civilization, Slaanesh began to understand what her brothers had faced in their final moments. The God-Killer was not simply powerful, he was proof against the very concepts that defined her existence. Where she offered temptation, he found purpose. Where she promised pleasure, he discovered duty. Where she sought to create dependency, he demonstrated the beauty of choosing service, freely given rather than compelled. "You would make them alone," she whispered, her form beginning to lose cohesion as the philosophical foundations of her domain crumbled around her. "Without gods to guide them, without divine purpose to give their existence meaning, they will be truly alone in an indifferent universe." Kratos paused in his advance, his scarred features reflecting something that might have been compassion. "Yes, and in that loneliness, they will find each other. In that freedom, they will choose to build something beautiful rather than simply consuming what others have created. In that absence of divine meaning, they will discover what meaning they can make for themselves." The Dark Prince felt the truth of his words like acid poured onto exposed nerves. This was not simply another enemy seeking her destruction. This was judgment incarnate, offering her followers something she could never provide, the possibility of finding fulfillment that did not require her constant intervention to maintain. And in that moment of perfect understanding, Slaanesh realized she had made the greatest mistake any god had ever made. She had tried to tempt someone whose ultimate desire was for temptation itself to end. The fourth and final silence was beginning, and it would be the most terrible of all, not the absence of sensation or pleasure, but the presence of choice freely made, without divine coercion, to influence the outcome. The death of desire was unlike anything the universe had witnessed since consciousness first learned to want. Where her brothers had dissolved with rage, acceptance, or mathematical precision, Slaanesh faced her unmaking with something approaching wonder. She had spent millions of years believing that all beings could be understood through their appetites, that every soul could be mapped according to its hungers and desires. The discovery that she had been fundamentally wrong was both terrifying and exhilarating. "You are beautiful," she whispered, as her form began to lose cohesion, her voice carrying harmonics of genuine awe rather than calculated seduction. "Not in any way I can possess or corrupt, but in your absolute refusal to be anything other than what necessity demands. I have never encountered anyone who could resist me by simply not wanting what I offered." The palace of pleasure was collapsing around them, its architecture of crystallized longing returning to the raw warp stuff from which it had been constructed. But the dissolution was not violent or chaotic. Instead, it resembled the careful dismantling of a master craftsman's work, each element returning to its constituent parts with something approaching dignity. "What will they do without us?" Slaanesh asked, her consciousness fragmenting as the concepts that defined her were systematically edited from reality's source code. "My children, my followers, the mortals who found meaning in their desires. What will give their lives purpose when there are no gods to rebel against or serve?" Kratos watched her dissolution with the same measured attention he had shown her brothers, the blades of chaos now burning with flames so pure they had transcended heat and light to become something closer to concentrated intention. They will discover what purpose they can create for themselves. And if they choose poorly? If freedom proves too heavy a burden to bear? "Then they will learn from their mistakes," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made every possible error in judgment and survived the consequences. "And their children will learn from those lessons, and their children's children will build something better. That is what mortals do when they are free to choose their own path." The Dark Prince felt her essence scattering like perfume on cosmic winds, each fragment carrying with it the accumulated sensations of 65 million years. But even as oblivion claimed her, she experienced something she had never known: genuine respect for someone who had proven immune to every form of corruption she could devise. "You are not what any of us expected," she murmured, her voice now barely a whisper in dimensions that were ceasing to exist. "We thought you were another conqueror, another tyrant seeking to replace us with your own dominion. But you seek to replace us with nothing, with choice itself." The final fragments of her consciousness dissolved into the void, leaving behind not silence but its opposite: the capacity for mortals to create their own meaning without divine intervention to guide or corrupt their choices. The fourth and final silence fell across the galaxy, like snow on a battlefield, covering everything in pristine emptiness that was not absence but potential. On Terra, in the deepest chambers of the imperial palace, the God-Emperor felt the change like a physical weight lifting from his consciousness. For 10,000 years, he had maintained a psychic vigil against the ruinous powers, holding back their influence through constant effort that had cost him everything resembling normal existence. Now, for the first time since the Horus heresy had torn the imperium apart, that vigil was no longer necessary. The Golden Throne, that magnificent life support system that had kept him functioning at the edge of death for 100 centuries, registered fluctuations that its machine spirits could not categorize. Not improvement in his condition, but change. The psychic pressure that had required such massive technological intervention to sustain was simply gone. In the throne room, the custodian guards felt a tremor pass through their ranks. Not fear or uncertainty, but something far more disturbing: the sudden absence of the eternal enemy that had defined their purpose since the Great Crusade began. They had been created to protect the Emperor from threats both material and spiritual. What was their role when the greatest spiritual threat in the galaxy had simply ceased to exist? The effects rippled outward from Terra like a stone cast into still water, touching every imperial world in ways both subtle and profound. Chaos cults that had operated in secret for millennia found their rituals producing no results, their dark prayers echoing in silence that offered no response. Traitor Space Marines discovered that their mutations were stabilizing, their connection to patron powers severed so completely that they could no longer sense the difference between blessed and cursed ground. Most unsettling of all were the reports flooding in from the Eye of Terror itself. The massive warp storm that had torn reality apart for 10,000 years was dissipating. Not violently, not all at once, but with the steady inevitability of weather systems returning to natural patterns after the forces that had sustained them were removed. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching sensor readings that her training had never prepared her to interpret. The Eye of Terror, that cosmic wound that had served as the source of humanity's greatest nightmares, was healing. Space-time was resuming normal configurations. Stars that had been swallowed by chaos energies were becoming visible again for the first time in 10 millennia. "Ma'am," reported her aide, his voice tight with barely controlled confusion. "We're receiving confirmation from 17 different monitoring stations. The warp, it's stabilizing. Across the entire galaxy. Astropathic communication is clearer than it's been since the Age of Strife. Navigation through the imperium is becoming routine." Vex felt a chill that had nothing to do with her ship's environmental systems. For all the terror that chaos had brought to the galaxy, it had also provided humanity with something that they were about to discover was equally important: a clear, external enemy to unite against. Without the ruinous powers to blame for corruption and failure, without the ever-present threat of demonic invasion to justify authoritarian measures, the Imperium would be forced to confront uncomfortable questions about its own nature. What was the justification for the Ecclesiarchy's dominance when there were no chaos gods to guard against? What purpose did the Inquisition serve when heresy could no longer be defined as worship of the ruinous powers? How could the High Lords of Terra maintain control over a galaxy when the great external threat that had justified their authority for 10,000 years had simply ended? The questions multiplied like bacteria in a wound, spreading through every level of imperial hierarchy, as officers and administrators struggled to understand their roles in a post-chaos galaxy. In the Eye of Terror, or what remained of it, similar transformations were occurring on a scale that defied comprehension. Demon worlds were reverting to normal planetary configurations, their impossible geometries collapsing into physics that obeyed natural law. The traitor legions found themselves scattered across suddenly normal space, their unholy unity fractured now that the gods who had bound them together were gone. Some, like the Death Guard who had been offered redemption during Nurgle's dissolution, used this freedom to seek atonement for millennia of atrocities. Others, particularly among the Emperor's children and world-eaters, struggled to cope with the absence of divine influence, their personalities so thoroughly shaped by chaos corruption that freedom felt more like exile than liberation. But perhaps the most profound change was occurring among ordinary mortals throughout the galaxy. For the first time in human history, conscious beings could experience the full range of emotion without fear that their feelings might attract the attention of entities that fed on such experiences. Anger no longer carried the risk of Khorne's influence. Despair could not summon Nurgle's gifts. Ambition would not draw Tzeentch's attention. Desire could be pursued without fear of Slaanesh's corruption. The psychological effects were staggering. Artists who had spent lifetimes suppressing their creativity for fear of attracting demonic attention suddenly found themselves free to explore new forms of expression. Scholars could pursue knowledge without worrying that their curiosity might open doorways to forbidden realms. Leaders could make decisions based on genuine conviction rather than calculating which choice would be least likely to serve chaos. It should have been a golden age of human achievement and exploration. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. Freedom, it turned out, was terrifying in ways that slavery had never been. When every choice carried the risk of eternal consequences, when every decision might serve the interests of cosmic enemies, it was possible to find comfort in the knowledge that failure was rarely entirely one's own fault. Now, suddenly, mortals were faced with the awful responsibility of choosing their own paths without divine scapegoats to blame for the results. In the void where the Palace of Pleasure had once stood, Kratos felt the weight of completed necessity settling upon his shoulders like a shroud woven from starlight. The task that had defined him for longer than civilizations endured was finished. The Chaos Gods were gone, their influence severed from reality with surgical precision. The galaxy was free to choose its own destiny without their interference. And in that freedom, he found something he had not expected: loneliness. For so long, he had been defined by opposition, by the need to end what should not exist. Now, in the absence of cosmic threats requiring his intervention, he was faced with a question he had not considered in millennia. What did Kratos want to become when Kratos the God-Killer was no longer needed? The blades of chaos hung silent at his sides, their flames dimmed to barely visible embers. Around him, the void waited with infinite patience for him to decide what came next. Behind him, the galaxy was taking its first tentative steps toward a future it would have to build without gods to guide or corrupt its choices. The war was over. The victory was complete, and for the first time since he had first taken up arms against divine tyrants, the God-Killer found himself with no enemies left to fight, and no clear understanding of who he was supposed to be when the fighting ended. The silence was absolute, and it was terrifying in its completeness. 6 months after the death of the last dark god, the galaxy had begun to learn what freedom actually cost. The changes were not universal or uniform. On some worlds, liberation from chaos influence sparked Renaissance periods that historians would later compare to humanity's greatest golden ages. Artists who had spent lifetimes constraining their creativity to avoid demonic attention suddenly found themselves free to explore forms of beauty that had been forbidden for millennia. Scientists could pursue knowledge without calculating whether their discoveries might serve the ruinous powers. Engineers built wonders without fear that innovation might attract the attention of entities that fed on mortal ambition. But for every world that bloomed in the absence of chaos, another withered under the weight of choices that no longer carried divine consequences to blame for their outcomes. On Cadia, that fortress world which had stood as humanity's bulwark against the eye of terror for 10,000 years, entire regiments of shock troopers found themselves struggling with an identity crisis of unprecedented scope. They had been bred, trained, and indoctrinated for a single purpose: to hold the line against chaos incursions that would never come again. Their military traditions, their cultural identity, their sense of purpose, all had been defined by opposition to an enemy that no longer existed. General Mordian Casey stood in the command bunker, where his ancestors had planned defenses against demon legions for 100 generations, staring at tactical displays that showed nothing but empty space where the eye of terror had once torn reality apart. His aide, Colonel Varen, waited with the patience of someone who had learned that their commanding officer had been spending increasing amounts of time in silent contemplation since the final silence fell. "Sir," Varen said eventually, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a subordinate addressing a superior who might be having a breakdown. "The Administratum is requesting our response to the new deployment orders. They want to know if we're prepared to transition to civilian infrastructure development." Kays laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Civilian infrastructure development. After 10 millennia of preparing for the apocalypse, they want us to build roads and water treatment facilities. The galaxy does need rebuilding, sir. Chaos has left scars that will take centuries to heal, even if it can no longer actively corrupt our efforts. That's not the point, Colonel. Kayes turned from the displays, and Varen saw something in his commander's eyes that was more disturbing than fear or rage: emptiness. Do you know what we've discovered in the past 6 months? Without an external enemy to unite against, the Imperium is fracturing. The High Lords can barely maintain unity within the same solar system, let alone across a galaxy. The Ecclesiarchy is splitting into 17 different schisms as they debate what the Imperial Creed means when there are no Chaos Gods to define themselves in opposition to. The Colonel had no answer for that. Reports from across the Imperium painted a similar picture: institutions that had functioned for millennia through shared opposition to chaos were discovering that they had little else in common. Without the unifying threat of the ruinous powers, long-suppressed political, theological, and cultural differences were surfacing with increasing frequency. On Macragga, Robut Guilliman faced a crisis that no amount of tactical genius could solve. The Primarch sat in his private study, surrounded by reports from across Ultramar and the Greater Imperium, each document painting a picture of accelerating social transformation that defied every model of governance the Imperium had developed over 10,000 years. "My lord," said Chief Librarian Tigurius, his psychic gifts now operating with a clarity that would have been impossible when the warp churned with chaos energies. "I must report that the situation is complex. Without the constant threat of chaos corruption, many worlds are questioning the necessity of imperial authority. They're arguing that if there are no longer external spiritual threats to guard against, what justification exists for centralized control from Terra?" Guilliman rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of administrative burdens that were becoming more complex rather than simpler in the absence of cosmic enemies. "What about the Astra Militarum? How are our forces adapting to garrison duty without the possibility of chaos incursions?" "That may be our greatest challenge, my lord. Soldiers who spent their entire careers preparing for demonic invasions are struggling to find purpose in peacekeeping operations. Suicide rates have increased by 300% across 17 different regiments. They're calling it victory syndrome, the psychological collapse that occurs when warriors discover that winning the ultimate war leaves them with no clear role in the peace that follows." The Primarch stood and walked to the great window that overlooked Macragga's restored landscapes. In the distance, he could see construction projects that would have been impossible under chaos influence, not because the technology was lacking, but because the hope required to invest in long-term infrastructure had been suppressed by millennia of existential threat. "We built an entire civilization around the concept of eternal war," he said quietly. "Our institutions, our culture, our psychology, all of it designed to function in a state of permanent crisis. Now that the crisis is over, we're discovering that we don't know how to be anything other than warriors preparing for the next battle." Tigurius joined him at the window, his psychic senses detecting currents of change that rippled through the immaterium like waves on a vast ocean. "Perhaps that is why the God-Killer has not departed our reality. He understands that ending the old war was only the beginning of a new form of struggle." In the void where the crystal labyrinth had once stood, Kratos felt the weight of that observation, like a physical pressure against his consciousness. He had not left the galaxy after completing his mission, though he could not articulate exactly why. Something kept him tethered to this reality, watching as mortals struggled to adapt to the freedom he had purchased for them with the blood of gods. The blades of chaos remained at his sides, their flames reduced to barely perceptible embers. Without divine enemies to fight, the weapons seemed almost ornamental, relics of a war that had ended so completely that even the memory of why it had been necessary was beginning to fade from mortal consciousness. But Kratos had lived too long and seen too much to believe that the absence of gods meant the absence of threats. Mortals, freed from external corruption, were perfectly capable of creating their own forms of tyranny and suffering. Without chaos to blame for their failures, they would find other scapegoats, other justifications for cruelty and oppression. The question that haunted him was whether this was simply the natural order of things, whether conscious beings required external enemies to unite against, and would inevitably create new forms of conflict when the old ones were eliminated. On the former daemon world of Medringard, this question was being answered in ways that defied every expectation of post-chaos recovery. The planet, once twisted into impossible configurations by the influence of the Dark Mechanicus, had reverted to standard physical laws when the gods died. But instead of becoming a dead world or reverting to its original state, it had become something unprecedented, a testing ground for new forms of human society. The survivors, a mixture of former cultists, redeemed traitor marines and imperial refugees who had arrived in the wake of Chaos's dissolution, had established communities that operated by principles no imperial world had ever attempted. Without the threat of Chaos corruption to justify authoritarian control, they were experimenting with forms of governance based on genuine consent rather than imposed obedience. The results were messy. Democracy, it turned out, was chaotic in ways that had nothing to do with the ruinous powers. Representatives argued constantly over resource allocation, personal freedoms, and the proper response to crime, when execution or lobotomization were no longer acceptable punishments for fear of attracting divine attention. But the chaos was fundamentally different from what had come before. It was the chaos of choice, of competing visions for the future, rather than the chaos of corruption consuming everything it touched. Sister Superior Cassandra Vex had taken leave from the Inquisition to observe these experiments firsthand, though she was not entirely certain why. Perhaps because her order's purpose, rooting out chaos corruption, had become obsolete overnight, leaving her with skills that were no longer relevant and a psychological framework built around enemies that no longer existed. She stood in the observation gallery of Medringard's primary assembly hall, watching elected representatives debate the construction of a water purification plant with the same intensity that imperial commanders had once brought to planning defenses against demon legions. The passion was real, the stakes mattered to the participants, but the scale was so mundane compared to what she had once fought against. "It's strange, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. She turned to find Marcus Caney, a former word-bearer who had been among the first to accept redemption when Chaos influence ended. His power armor had been stripped of all devotional iconography, leaving behind ceramite that was functional but unadorned. Watching mortals argue about sewage systems with the same fervor they once brought to theological debates about the nature of the divine. "Is it better?" Vex asked, genuinely uncertain of the answer. "This ordinariness?" Caney was quiet for a long moment, watching as the assembly voted on an amendment regarding the placement of filtration equipment. "I don't know. But it's honest in a way that nothing was when the gods were whispering in our ears. These people are arguing about what they actually want, not about how to interpret divine will or avoid cosmic punishment. The results might be less dramatically consequential, but they're more authentic." Vex felt a chill of recognition. That was what had been bothering her about the post-chaos galaxy. Not that it was worse or better than what had come before, but that it was genuine in ways that 65 million years of divine influence had made impossible. Mortals were finally free to be themselves, with all the messy complexity that entailed. The question was whether that freedom was worth the price of losing the certainty that had come with external enemies to define themselves against. In the depths of space, where the Palace of Pleasure had once defied physical law through the architecture of crystallized desire, Kratos contemplated similar questions. He had freed the galaxy from divine tyranny, but freedom itself was proving to be a burden that many souls were unprepared to bear. Some thrived in the absence of cosmic constraints. Others collapsed under the weight of choices that no longer carried the safety net of divine scapegoats to blame for negative consequences. Most were simply confused, struggling to build new identities in the absence of the external threats that had defined their cultures for millennia. And through it all, the god-killer watched and wondered whether he had actually solved anything, or simply transformed one set of problems into another. The gods were gone, but mortals remained mortal, flawed, contradictory, capable of both sublime beauty and casual cruelty. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the simple elimination of external corruption, of divine manipulation that transformed natural mortal failings into cosmic threats, was victory sufficient unto itself. But as he observed the galaxy struggling to adapt to freedom, Kratos could not shake the suspicion that his real work was just beginning. 1 year after the final silence, the galaxy had begun to dream again. The change was subtle at first, visible only to those who understood what to look for. Children born since the death of the Chaos gods showed patterns of behavior that psychologists struggled to categorize. They experienced emotions with an intensity and purity that their parents found both beautiful and terrifying. Without the constant background influence of entities that fed on strong feelings, the younger generation was developing psychological frameworks that had been impossible for 65 million years. On Ultramar, in the great libraries of Macragge, scholars were documenting phenomena that had no precedent in imperial history. Children who laughed without the reflexive fear that joy might attract Slaanesh's attention. Adolescents who pursued knowledge with passion, unrestrained by the terror that curiosity might open pathways for Tzeentch's corruption. Young adults who felt righteous anger at injustice without worrying that their fury might serve Khorne's purposes. It was, the scholars agreed, the first generation in human history to experience pure emotion, feeling without the psychological contamination that had defined consciousness since the birth of the dark gods. But purity, they were discovering, came with its own challenges. Sister Dialogue's Marina Vasquez had spent her career studying the psychological effects of chaos corruption, developing techniques for identifying and treating spiritual contamination before it could spread. Now she found herself retrained as something unprecedented in imperial history, a therapist for normal human beings experiencing normal human emotions at their natural intensity. The problem, she explained to her colleague, Apothecary Helix of the Ultramarines, is that we've spent 10,000 years building psychological frameworks designed to suppress or channel strong emotions to prevent chaos corruption. Our entire understanding of mental health is based on the assumption that feeling too much of anything is dangerous. They stood in the observation gallery of Macragge's new psychological development center, watching as children played games that would have been considered spiritually hazardous just 1 year earlier. The young ones competed with genuine passion, experienced defeat without the crushing despair that might have attracted Nurgle's attention, celebrated victory without the excess that could have drawn Slaanesh's notice. And now, Helix asked, his enhanced physiognomy registering stress markers in the children that didn't correspond to any form of corruption his training could identify. Now we're learning what normal human psychology actually looks like when it's allowed to develop without divine interference. It's intense, beautiful in many ways, but also more complex than anything we've encountered before. These children aren't suppressing their emotions. They're learning to navigate them, to use them as tools for understanding themselves and the world around them. Helix watched a young girl comfort a boy who had lost a game, her empathy so genuine and unforced that it seemed to physically brighten the space around them. Is it sustainable? Can human society function with this level of emotional intensity? We're about to find out, Vasquez replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone observing an experiment that could reshape the fundamental nature of human civilization. The first generation of truly free humans is growing up. What they become will determine what humanity becomes. The implications rippled far beyond Ultramar. Across the galaxy, similar observations were being recorded by scholars, administrators, and military commanders struggling to understand a species that was transforming before their eyes. Without external spiritual corruption to suppress or channel emotional development, humanity was rediscovering psychological depths that had been buried for millennia. The effects extended beyond individual psychology to collective behavior. Worlds that had maintained social stability through rigid hierarchies designed to prevent chaos infiltration were discovering that their populations no longer accepted authoritarian control without question. Citizens who felt genuine emotions rather than suppressed ones were more likely to demand genuine representation rather than imposed order. On Terra itself, the ramifications of this transformation were creating crises that no amount of administrative expertise could resolve. Lord Commander Guilliman stood in the chamber of the High Lords, facing representatives from across the Imperium who were all grappling with similar reports of social transformation. "The statistics are undeniable," reported High Lord Admiral Khorne, her uniform bearing decorations from campaigns against enemies that no longer existed. "Civil unrest has increased by 400% across the inner worlds. Not rebellion, the populations remain loyal to the Emperor's vision. But they're demanding changes to how that vision is implemented." "What kind of changes?" asked High Lord Militant Apostolic Carmenos, his voice carrying the tension of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged by post-war realities, representation in governance decisions that affect their worlds, transparency in resource allocation, the right to question orders that don't serve clear strategic purposes. Khorne's expression suggested she found these concepts as alien as her audience did. "They're asking why the Imperium needs to maintain wartime authority structures when there's no longer a war to fight." Guilliman felt the weight of 10,000 years of precedent pressing against the reality of a fundamentally changed galaxy. The Imperium had been designed as a war machine, its every institution optimized for survival against existential threats. But those threats were gone, and the citizens who had endured authoritarian rule for the sake of species, survival, were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about whether such rule was still necessary. "What about the Astra Militarum?" he asked. "How are our forces adapting to peacekeeping operations?" "That may be our greatest challenge," replied Lord Castellan Valdron, her scarred features reflecting decades of battlefield command. "Units that functioned perfectly in war are struggling with peace. Soldiers trained to kill chaos cultists don't know how to handle citizens who are protesting tax policies or demanding infrastructure improvements. We're having to completely retrain our forces for operations that don't involve eliminating enemies." The Primarch stood and walked to the great window that overlooked the Imperial Palace, its Gothic spires now seeming almost quaint in their aggressive grandeur. Outside, he could see construction projects that would have been impossible under chaos influence, not just because the threat of corruption had prevented such investments, but because the hope required to build for the future had been systematically suppressed by cosmic forces that fed on mortal despair. "We built a civilization designed to survive apocalypse," he said quietly. "Every institution, every law, every cultural tradition, all of it calibrated for eternal war against enemies that sought our spiritual destruction. Now that those enemies are gone, we're discovering that we don't know how to be anything other than survivors preparing for the next catastrophe." In the void between realities, Kratos felt the truth of that observation like a weight settling upon his consciousness. He had eliminated the external threats that had defined human civilization for 65 million years, but in doing so, he had forced an entire species to confront fundamental questions about who they were when they were no longer fighting for their very souls. The blades of chaos remained dormant at his sides, their flames so dim as to be barely perceptible. Without gods to fight, without cosmic threats to eliminate, the weapons seemed almost decorative, relics of a war that had ended so completely that even the memory of why it had been necessary was beginning to fade from mortal consciousness. But Kratos was beginning to understand that his role in this reality was not finished. The galaxy needed something different now, not a destroyer of gods, but something far more complex and challenging. A teacher. The realization came not as revelation, but as gradual recognition of what had been building in his consciousness for months. Mortals freed from divine corruption were like children learning to walk. They had the capacity for extraordinary beauty and achievement, but they also had the capacity to stumble, to fall, to make mistakes that could have lasting consequences. They needed guidance, not from gods who would shape them according to divine will, but from someone who understood both the heights of achievement and the depths of failure that consciousness could reach. On the world of Armageddon, this need was becoming increasingly apparent. The planet had been transformed by decades of warfare against orc invasions, its population hardened by constant conflict into a society that knew only war. With the elimination of chaos influence, the orc threat had not disappeared, but it had become manageable, predictable. The greenskins still fought, but without the psychic resonance that chaos corruption had provided, their invasions followed patterns that could be anticipated and countered through conventional military doctrine. For the first time in centuries, Armageddon's population was faced with the possibility of peace, and they had no idea what to do with it. General Helena Mordax stood in the command bunker, where her predecessors had planned defenses against orc hordes for 300 years, staring at tactical displays that showed nothing. No enemy movements, no signs of impending invasion, just empty sensor sweeps and routine patrol reports. Her aide, Colonel Thane, waited with the patience of someone who had learned that his commanding officer had been spending increasing amounts of time in contemplative silence since the galaxy's fundamental nature had changed. "Ma'am," Thane said eventually, his voice carrying carefully controlled confusion, "the civilian authorities are requesting military assistance with the construction of recreational facilities, parks, entertainment venues, libraries." Mordax laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Recreational facilities, 3 centuries of preparing for the next orc invasion, and they want us to build playgrounds. The population is changing, ma'am. The children especially. Without the constant threat of invasion, they're developing interests that have nothing to do with warfare. Art, music, sciences that aren't related to weapons development." The general turned from her displays, and Thane saw something in her expression that was more disturbing than fear or anger. Confusion so profound it bordered on existential crisis. "What is our purpose, Colonel, in a galaxy that no longer needs warriors?" Before Thane could answer, the air in the command bunker shimmered, and a figure materialized from dimensional spaces that existed between one heartbeat and the next. The general's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, but stopped when she recognized the pale warrior who had become legend throughout the Imperium. Kratos stood in the center of the command bunker, the blades of chaos dormant at his sides, his ancient eyes taking in the tactical displays that showed a world struggling to understand peace. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond normal perception. "Your purpose," he said, addressing not just Mordax, but some deeper question that all of them were wrestling with, "is the same as it has always been: to protect. But now you must learn to protect different things, not just lives from external enemies, but possibilities from internal fears, not just bodies from corruption, but souls from the despair that comes with purposelessness." Mordax felt something in her chest unclench, a tension she had not realized she was carrying. How? By learning to build as well as destroy. By teaching others to find meaning in creation, rather than just in opposition to external threats. By understanding that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of choices freely made. The God-Killer stepped toward the great window that looked out over Armageddon's scarred landscape, where even now she could see construction crews beginning the long work of transforming a fortress world into something that might one day resemble a home. "I eliminated the gods who fed on your fears and corrupted your choices," he continued, "but I cannot create meaning for you. That is something each soul must discover for itself. The question is not what you are without war to fight, but what you choose to become now that the choice is truly yours. Mordax felt tears on her cheeks, the first she had shed since childhood, and realized they were not tears of grief but of something far more complex, the overwhelming weight and beauty of genuine freedom. For the first time since the final silence fell, she began to understand what victory actually meant. 3 years after the final silence, the God-Killer had become something unprecedented in his long existence. A teacher who traveled between worlds not to destroy, but to guide mortals in their first stumbling steps toward genuine freedom. The transformation had not been sudden or dramatic. Rather, it had emerged gradually, as Kratos recognized that liberation from divine tyranny was only the first step in a far more complex journey. Mortals freed from chaos corruption were like survivors of a plague who had to relearn how to live without the constant presence of disease. They possessed the capacity for health, but needed guidance in understanding what health actually meant. On Valhalla Prime, a world that had spent 8,000 years as a training ground for soldiers destined to die fighting demons, Kratos stood before an assembly of former officers who were struggling to adapt their institutional knowledge to peacetime governance. The great amphitheater that had once hosted tactical briefings on demon-fighting techniques now served as a forum for debates about civil engineering and agricultural policy. General Casus Vrame, a veteran of 17 chaos incursions, raised his scarred hand to address the pale warrior who had become an irregular but welcome presence on their world. God-Killer, we face a dilemma that our training never prepared us for. The younger generation, those born since the silence, they question everything. Military hierarchy, strategic doctrine, even the necessity of maintaining standing forces at all. How do we preserve necessary knowledge while adapting to their different perspective? Kratos stood at the center of the amphitheater, the blades of chaos sheathed but visible, their presence a reminder of the war that had ended to make such questions possible. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned these lessons through personal experience rather than theoretical study. You preserve knowledge not by demanding blind obedience to old forms, but by teaching the principles that made those forms necessary, he replied. Show them why discipline matters, not through imposed authority, but through demonstrated results. Let them discover for themselves that freedom requires structure to be sustainable. Another officer, Colonel Miranda Voss, leaned forward with the intensity of someone grappling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership. But what if they choose poorly? What if they reject military discipline entirely and leave themselves vulnerable to threats we can see, but they cannot? Then they will learn from their mistakes, Kratos answered, his expression reflecting both compassion and the terrible certainty of someone who had made every possible error in judgment. Freedom means the right to make wrong choices and bear the consequences. Your role is not to prevent them from choosing, but to ensure they understand what they are choosing between. He gestured toward the younger officers present, men and women who had come of age in a galaxy where strong emotions no longer attracted cosmic predators, where curiosity could be pursued without fear of opening pathways for corruption. Their faces showed an openness that would have been dangerous under chaos influence, but was becoming the defining characteristic of post-war humanity. Look at them, Kratos continued. They question your authority, not because they reject the concept of leadership, but because they have never known leadership that was not justified by external threat. Show them what leadership looks like when it exists to serve rather than to control. Demonstrate that hierarchy can be chosen rather than imposed. The discussion that followed would have been impossible under the old order. Junior officers questioning senior commanders, civilians challenging military necessity, individuals demanding explanations for policies that had once been accepted without question. It was messy, inefficient, and occasionally frustrating for those accustomed to unquestioned obedience. It was also beautiful in its authenticity. From Valhalla Prime, Kratos traveled to Skollum Sykerna academies, where young psychers were learning to develop their abilities without the constant terror that their gifts might serve as conduits for demonic invasion. The young ones are different, Valerius explained as they walked through training halls where potential psychers practiced meditation techniques rather than banishment rituals. They show none of the fear, none of the constant vigilance that kept previous generations alive. They treat their psychic abilities as natural talents rather than dangerous burdens. Kratos watched a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, create complex light patterns in the air with casual ease that would have been considered recklessly dangerous just a few years earlier. Her instructor, a former inquisitor whose entire worldview had been restructured by the absence of chaos, encouraged experimentation that would have once been grounds for immediate execution. "Is this concerning to you?" Kratos asked, recognizing the tension in Valerius's bearing. "It should be," the Grey Knight replied, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose fundamental purpose had been achieved so completely that he no longer understood his own role. "Everything in my training says this level of psychic openness should result in massive demonic incursions. But the incursions never come, because there are no demons left to breach reality. These children are developing abilities we never imagined possible, because they're not constrained by the fear that shaped every previous generation of psychers." And Valerius was quiet for a long moment, watching as the young girl began teaching her techniques to other students, sharing knowledge with the generous confidence of someone who had never known that such gifts could be corrupted. "And I'm beginning to understand that we may have been holding back human potential for 10,000 years in the name of protecting it from corruption. These children are showing us what psychers might have become if they had never needed to fear their own abilities." The observation resonated through the academy like a bell struck in perfect silence. Throughout the Imperium, similar realizations were occurring as institutions designed to suppress human potential for the sake of species survival discovered what that potential looked like when it was allowed to develop without constraint. On Holy Terra itself, these changes were creating upheavals that reached the highest levels of imperial administration. In the Senatorum Imperialis, representatives from across the galaxy were debating fundamental questions about the nature of the Imperium itself. "The statistics are undeniable," reported Fabricator General Call, his augmented voice carrying data streams that painted a picture of transformation so complete that it challenged every model of human society the Mechanicus had developed over 10 millennia. Innovation rates have increased by 700% across all technological disciplines. Art, literature, and music are experiencing what historians are calling a Renaissance period, comparable to humanity's greatest cultural achievements. Birth rates are stabilizing at sustainable levels as populations gain confidence in the future. High Lord Guilliman stood at the center of the Great Chamber, surrounded by representatives who were all grappling with the implications of governing a species that was rapidly outgrowing the institutions designed to constrain it. And the challenges? Significant, but different in nature from what we previously faced, Cowell continued. Civil unrest has evolved from rebellion against authority to demands for participation in governance. Crime rates have decreased, but the definition of what constitutes crime is being questioned. The populations are not rejecting law. They are demanding that law serve justice rather than simple order. Lord Castellan Valdren leaned forward, her scarred features reflecting decades of military experience that was becoming increasingly irrelevant. "What about defense capabilities? Are we prepared for external threats?" "That may be our greatest transformation," replied Admiral Quarren. "Without the need to maintain constant vigilance against chaos corruption, we've been able to redirect resources toward exploration and technological development. Our defensive capabilities have actually increased, but they're now based on genuine strategic doctrine rather than paranoid over-preparation for enemies that might never come." Guilliman felt the weight of 10,000 years of precedent pressing against the reality of a fundamentally transformed galaxy. The imperium had been designed as a survival mechanism, its every institution optimized for species continuity against existential threats. But those threats were gone, and the citizens who had endured authoritarian rule for the sake of survival were evolving into something unprecedented in human history. "Recommendations?" he asked. The response came not from his advisors, but from an unexpected source. The air in the great chamber shimmered, and Kratos materialized from dimensional spaces that existed between certainty and possibility. The assembled High Lords tensed reflexively, but their fear was tempered by recognition. This was the being who had made their current dilemmas possible by eliminating the external threats that had defined their civilization. "You already know the answer," the God Killer said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the chamber's Gothic architecture. "You must choose whether to evolve with your people or attempt to constrain them within structures they have outgrown." "And if we choose poorly?" Guilliman asked, recognizing the question as an echo of concerns being raised across the galaxy. "Then you will learn from your mistakes, as I learned from mine," Kratos replied. "The alternative, attempting to maintain control through systems designed for a different reality, will not preserve stability. It will only delay the inevitable while creating resentment that could have been avoided." He moved to the great window that looked out over the Imperial Palace, its Gothic spires now seeming almost anachronistic in their aggressive grandeur. Outside, construction crews were working on projects that represented the new reality: schools, hospitals, research facilities, cultural centers, infrastructure for a civilization that was learning to live rather than merely survive. "I did not eliminate the Chaos Gods so that mortals could remain unchanged," Kratos continued. "I freed you from external corruption so that you could discover what you might become when the choice was genuinely yours. The transformation you are witnessing is not a crisis to be managed. It is the very purpose for which the war was fought." Guilliman joined him at the window, looking out over a terror that was slowly transforming from a fortress world into something that might one day deserve to be called home. "What comes next?" "That," Kratos said, his scarred features reflecting something that might have been satisfaction, "is for you to decide. My part in this story is ending. Yours is just beginning." The words hung in the air like a promise and a challenge, carrying with them the weight of absolute freedom and the terrible beauty of choices that would be made without divine interference to corrupt or constrain their outcomes. For the first time in 65 million years, mortals were truly free to write their own destiny. The God Killer had taught them how to hold the pen. Now it remained to be seen what story they would choose to tell. 10 years after the final silence, the galaxy had become something that would have been unrecognizable to any previous generation of human beings. The transformation was complete, not in the sense of being finished, but in the sense of having achieved irreversible momentum toward a future that no external force could corrupt or constrain. On New Olympus, a world that had been nothing more than empty space and cosmic dust when the Chaos Gods died, humanity had built its first truly free civilization. The planet had no history of corruption, no architectural remnants of authoritarian rule, no cultural memories of divine tyranny. It existed as pure possibility made manifest, a testing ground for what human society might become when it was designed from first principles rather than adapted from survival mechanisms. The cities were works of art that served practical functions, their spires reaching toward stars not in Gothic defiance, but in genuine aspiration. Gardens grew in patterns that followed mathematical principles discovered by children who had never known that curiosity could be dangerous. Transportation networks operated on consensus algorithms that would have been impossible when trust itself was a liability that enemies could exploit. In the great assembly of New Olympus, representatives from across the galaxy had gathered for something unprecedented in human history, a constitutional convention to establish principles of governance that assumed freedom rather than constraint as their starting point. The delegates were young by imperial standards. Most had been born since the silence fell, raised in a reality where strong emotions enhanced rather than endangered their communities. Kratos stood at the edge of the assembly hall, watching as mortals engaged in the complex, messy, beautiful process of determining their own destiny. The blades of chaos hung silent at his sides, their flames reduced to the faintest possible luminescence, not extinguished, but transformed into something closer to memorial fires than weapons of war. "God Killer," came a voice beside him. He turned to find Maria Santos, a delegate from the Tau border worlds where humans and Xenos had been experimenting with cooperative governance since the external threat of chaos corruption had been eliminated. "May I ask you something?" Kratos nodded, recognizing in her the kind of direct, uncompromised honesty that characterized the post-chaos generation. "Are you proud of what we've become?" The question carried weight that pressed against 10,000 years of accumulated experience. Kratos watched the assembly floor, where delegates debated the fundamental nature of justice, representation, and individual rights with the passionate intensity that previous generations had reserved for survival strategies. "Pride is too simple a word," he replied eventually. "You have become what you chose to become. That is more valuable than any emotion I might feel about the outcome." Maria frowned, her expression carrying the focused attention of someone who had never learned to accept incomplete answers. "But you made this possible. You freed us from influences that would have prevented these choices. Don't you feel satisfaction? Accomplishment?" Kratos was quiet for a long moment, watching as a young man from the Segmentum Solar presented a proposal for interstellar educational exchange that would have been impossible when travel between worlds carried the risk of spreading corruption. The delegate spoke with conviction, unmarred by fear, his ideas flowing freely because he had never known that innovation itself could be a form of heresy. "I feel something more complex than satisfaction," he said finally. "I feel the knowledge that you no longer need me. That is the only victory that has ever mattered." The debate on the assembly floor had moved to questions of resource allocation, specifically how to handle the abundance that had emerged when creativity was no longer constrained by the need to channel everything toward defense against cosmic enemies. Agricultural worlds were producing surplus food because farming techniques could advance without fear that innovation might attract unwanted attention. Manufacturing centers created goods of unprecedented quality and beauty because artisans could pursue perfection without worrying that excellence might serve as a pathway for corruption. "We face problems that no previous generation has encountered," observed Delegate Kairos from the Maelstrom sector. "Not the problems of scarcity or survival, but the problems of abundance and choice. How do we distribute resources when there are enough for everyone? How do we maintain motivation when basic needs are guaranteed? How do we handle disagreement when disagreement no longer carries the risk of species extinction?" The questions rippled through the assembly with the intensity of theological debates. But they were debates about practical governance rather than divine will. Mortals determining for themselves what mortal life should look like, without gods to provide meaning or enemies to provide purpose. From the observation gallery, Kratos watched this unprecedented experiment in self-determination with something approaching wonder. These beings were wrestling with the fundamental questions of existence: purpose, meaning, justice, beauty, and they were doing so without divine guidance or corruption. They were discovering for themselves what consciousness might become when it was truly free to explore its own nature. The proposals before us represent fundamentally different visions of human potential, said Delegate Chen from the former war world of Krieg. Her planet had spent 10 millennia breeding soldiers for battles that would never end, but the children born since the silence had refused to accept that genetic destiny. They were becoming artists, philosophers, engineers, whatever their individual natures called them to become. One vision suggests we establish systems to ensure optimal outcomes through planned distribution of resources and opportunities, Chen continued. Another proposes we allow maximum individual freedom and accept that some will choose poorly. A third recommends we create flexible frameworks that can adapt as we learn more about what we actually want to become. The debate that followed would have been impossible under any previous form of human governance. Representatives argued with genuine passion for different approaches to organizing society, but the arguments were not about survival or defense against external threats. They were about what form of life would be most worth living for. Conscious beings who were free to choose their own path. "What do you think?" Maria asked Kratos. "Which approach offers the best chance for long-term flourishing?" The god-killer considered the question with the weight it deserved. These mortals were asking him to use his accumulated experience to help them avoid mistakes that could shape their civilization for millennia to come. It was a responsibility that went beyond anything he had faced as a destroyer of gods or teacher of the liberated. "I think," he said slowly, "that the question itself is more important than any answer I could provide. The fact that you are asking these questions, that you are willing to experiment and learn from the results, that you understand your choices as choices rather than as inevitable responses to external pressure. That is what matters." He gestured toward the assembly floor where delegates were now breaking into smaller groups to explore different aspects of the constitutional questions. "Look at them. They are not asking me or anyone else to tell them what they should become. They are determining that for themselves, through discussion and debate and careful consideration of consequences. That is what freedom actually looks like." Maria followed his gaze, and her expression shifted as she recognized what he was showing her. "You're not going to tell us what to choose, are you?" "No," Kratos replied. "My role was to eliminate the forces that would have corrupted your choices and to teach you that you have the capacity to choose well. But the actual choosing, that must be yours alone, or it isn't really freedom." As if summoned by his words, the assembly called for a recess, and delegates began moving toward the observation galleries to continue their discussions in smaller groups. Several approached the area where Kratos stood, but their questions were not seeking his guidance so much as his perspective on issues they were working through themselves. "God-killer," said Delegate Torres from the Segmentum Pacificus. "We've been debating the role of conflict in a free society. Some argue that disagreement is inherently dangerous, that it might lead back to the kind of division that the Chaos Gods exploited. Others suggest that healthy conflict is necessary for growth and improvement. What has your experience taught you?" The question struck at the heart of everything Kratos had learned through centuries of violence and decades of teaching. "Conflict is not the problem," he replied. "Corruption of conflict is the problem. When disagreement serves truth-seeking, it strengthens communities. When it serves power-seeking, it destroys them. The difference lies not in avoiding conflict, but in ensuring that conflict remains honest." The conversation that followed drew in representatives from across the galaxy, each contributing perspectives shaped by their world's unique experiences with post-chaos transformation. But the discussion was not seeking a single correct answer, so much as exploring the complexity of questions that had no simple solutions. Watching these mortals wrestle with fundamental questions about the nature of existence, Kratos felt something he had not experienced in longer than civilizations had existed. Genuine hope for the future. Not hope that some external force would solve their problems, but hope that they had developed the capacity to solve problems for themselves. As the evening progressed and the formal assembly session ended, delegates continued their conversations in smaller groups throughout the city. Kratos found himself walking through streets that had been designed by minds free to pursue beauty without fear that aesthetic achievement might attract unwanted attention. The architecture was unlike anything that had existed under imperial rule. Functional but not brutalistic, inspiring but not ostentatious, designed to serve human flourishing rather than human survival. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" Maria had followed him from the assembly hall, her question carrying the directness that characterized her generation. Kratos paused beside a fountain whose mathematical precision would have been considered dangerously perfect under the old order. Children played in the water with the unself-conscious joy of beings who had never known that happiness itself could be a form of spiritual vulnerability. "My work here is finished," he said simply, "but there's still so much we don't know. So many challenges we haven't faced yet. What if we make mistakes? What if we choose poorly?" "Then you will learn from your mistakes and choose better next time," Kratos replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had made every possible error in judgment and survived to understand their consequences. That is what freedom means, the right to fail, and the responsibility to grow from failure. He looked up at stars that were visible through an atmosphere no longer choked with the psychic pollution of warp storms. Those stars held worlds where similar experiments in self-determination were taking place, where mortals were discovering what they might become when they were truly free to choose their own destiny. "I eliminated the gods who would have corrupted your choices," he continued. "I taught you to recognize that you have the capacity for wisdom, but wisdom itself, that you must develop through experience, through making choices, and living with their consequences, through building the kind of life that consciousness, freely chosen, creates for itself." Maria was quiet for a long time, watching the children play in water that sparkled with reflected starlight. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone accepting a burden that was also a gift. "Will we see you again?" Kratos smiled, and for the first time in longer than civilizations had existed, the expression carried no trace of sadness or burden. "That depends entirely on what you choose to become." The words hung in the air like a benediction and a challenge, carrying with them the terrible beauty of absolute freedom and the promise that whatever choices mortals made would be genuinely their own. 50 years after the final silence, the god-killer stood alone in the void between stars, watching as mortal civilizations spread across the galaxy like seeds taking root in fertile ground. The transformation was complete, not because it had reached some predetermined endpoint, but because it had achieved the capacity for endless renewal, each generation building upon the choices of the last, while remaining free to choose differently when circumstances demanded change. The blades of chaos hung silent at his sides, their flames finally extinguished after millennia of war. The weapons hadn't broken or been destroyed. They had simply fulfilled their purpose so completely that they no longer needed to exist as instruments of divine destruction. They remained now as reminders of what had been necessary to achieve what was no longer needed. From his position in the cosmic void, Kratos could perceive the galaxy as mortals never could, not as discrete worlds and systems, but as a living web of consciousness exploring its own potential. On 10,000 worlds, beings who had never known divine corruption were conducting experiments in living that would have been impossible under the old order. They succeeded. They failed. They learned from both outcomes and built something better from the lessons. On Armageddon, the fortress world had become a center for interspecies cooperation, where humans and orcs worked together on engineering projects that transformed their mutual love of conflict into competition over who could build the most impressive structures. The greenskins' natural aggression had not been suppressed. It had been channeled into pursuits that created rather than destroyed, turning warfare into art and violence into athletic achievement. On Cardia, The former Guardian world had evolved into a university planet where military strategic thinking was taught alongside philosophy, music, and theoretical xenobiology. The discipline that had once been focused on killing demons was now applied to solving resource allocation problems, mediating interplanetary disputes, and designing systems that could adapt to unexpected challenges without losing their fundamental integrity. On Terra itself, the Imperial Palace had been transformed into something unprecedented in human history, a museum and library dedicated not to celebrating past glories, but to preserving the lessons learned from past mistakes. The throne room, where the God Emperor had sacrificed himself to hold back chaos, was now a meditation hall where visitors could contemplate the cost of allowing external forces to define the meaning of existence. The changes were not universally smooth or successful. Some worlds had chosen isolation, their populations deciding that freedom was too complex, a burden to bear in community with others. Others had descended into chaos, not the supernatural corruption of the old chaos gods, but the natural chaos that occurred when conscious beings disagreed about fundamental questions without external authorities to impose resolution. But even these failures were different from what had come before. They were authentic failures, the result of genuine choices made by beings who understood the alternatives. And from each failure, other communities learned lessons that made their own experiments more likely to succeed. The Tau Empire had expanded, not through conquest, but through invitation, their philosophy of the greater good attractive to species who were discovering what it meant to choose cooperation rather than having unity imposed upon them. The Eldar had emerged from their craft worlds and webway hideouts, their children no longer bound by the rigid paths that had been necessary to prevent their emotions from feeding she who thirsts. The Necrons had begun the slow process of reawakening, not as conquerors seeking to reclaim a dead empire, but as archaeologists exploring what their ancient civilization might become if it chose to live rather than merely exist. Even the Orcs were evolving, their psychic field no longer constrained by the need to avoid attracting chaos attention. Their reality-warping beliefs were becoming more sophisticated, less focused on simple violence, and more interested in complex challenges that require genuine ingenuity to overcome. Some Orc clans had become builders, their love of mechanical complexity expressing itself in engineering projects that served entire star systems. Kratos observed these transformations with something beyond satisfaction or pride. He felt the deep peace that came with completed necessity, the recognition that a task which had seemed impossible when it began had been not only accomplished but transcended. The galaxy had not simply been freed from chaos corruption. It had discovered what lay beyond freedom in the realm of conscious choice applied to the fundamental questions of existence. Yet as he watched the unfolding of futures he had made possible, the God-Killer found himself facing a question he had not anticipated. What did someone do when their defining purpose had been fulfilled so completely that it no longer required their attention? The answer came not as sudden revelation, but as gradual recognition of what had been building in his consciousness for decades. Throughout the galaxy, mortals were conducting experiments in living that touched on every aspect of existence, except one. They were learning to handle life, but they had not yet learned to handle death, not the simple biological ending of individual organisms that had always been part of natural existence, but the deeper question of how consciousness might choose to conclude itself when conclusion became desirable, how beings who were truly free might elect to end their stories when those stories had reached their natural completion. It was, Kratos realized, the final lesson that someone who had spent eternity learning how to die gracefully might teach to species who were just beginning to understand what it meant to live freely. But this lesson would be different from all the others. It could not be imposed or demonstrated through direct intervention. It had to be discovered by beings who had reached the point where they understood that even existence itself was a choice rather than an obligation. On New Olympus, now the unofficial capital of a loosely federated galaxy, the descendants of the Constitutional Convention delegates were conducting their own experiments in governance, philosophy, and the arts. Their cities had evolved beyond even the beauty that had marked the early post-chaos period, becoming living expressions of what consciousness could create when it was truly free to explore its own nature. In the Great Assembly, now expanded to include representatives not just from human worlds, but from every sentient species in the galaxy, the current generation of delegates was debating questions that would have been incomprehensible to their predecessors. How should conscious beings handle the possibility of immortality now that the technology existed to prevent aging? What obligations did sapient species have to help less developed consciousness evolve? Should there be limits on the kinds of choices individuals could make if those choices might affect future generations? Watching these debates through perceptions that transcended space and time, Kratos felt a familiar stirring of purpose. Not the burning urgency that had driven his war against the Chaos Gods, but something quieter and more complex, the recognition that there was still work to be done, still lessons to be taught, still guidance that could be offered to beings who were ready to receive it. But this work would not require the blades of chaos or the kind of divine intervention that had defined his previous existence. It would require something more subtle and more patient, the willingness to be present when beings reached the point where they needed to understand that even the choice to continue existing was something they could make freely, without external pressure or divine mandate to compel their decision. The God-Killer smiled, and the expression carried none of the weight or sadness that had marked his features for so long. Instead, it reflected the quiet satisfaction of someone who had discovered that completion was not an ending, but a transformation into something new. Slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who had learned that the most important lessons could not be rushed, Kratos began to make himself known again to the galaxy he had freed. Not as a destroyer or even as a teacher, but as something unprecedented in his long existence, a guide for beings who were ready to explore the final frontier of consciousness, the understanding that true freedom included the freedom to choose how one's story should end. In the distance, on 10,000 worlds where mortals were conducting their experiments in living, children who had never known divine corruption began to sense a presence that offered not answers, but companionship for the deepest questions consciousness could ask. The war was over. The peace had been established. The true adventure of existence was just beginning, and whether the galaxy would choose to embrace this next phase of exploration or find some other path through the infinite possibilities of conscious choice, only time would tell. But whatever they chose, it would be genuinely their own decision, made by beings who understood that choice itself was the greatest gift that existence could offer. There was no ending. There was only the eternal renewal of possibility, and the quiet presence of someone who had learned to die well, offering to teach that final lesson to those who were ready to learn. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of potential, waiting to unfold.